Operational boundaries. An introduction. As mentioned in the previous module, organizational boundaries determine which business operations will be included in a company's inventory. Once a company has identified those operations, it must identify all of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those operations. These emissions could come from a variety of sources, such as electricity use, business travel, product and material distribution, the use of furnaces, generators, and incinerators. Once all the emissions have been identified, they must be categorized as either direct or indirect. Next, the company must decide which indirect emissions it will account for. This process is known as setting operational boundaries. To put it simply, setting operational boundaries is a three-step process. The first step is identifying emissions. The second step is categorizing emissions as direct or indirect. And the third step is determining which indirect emissions will be accounted for. Operational boundaries are a critical component of a greenhouse gas inventory because ultimately, they determine which emissions will be accounted for. So, we're first going to dissect this process and take a closer look at each of the three elements. First, we will focus on how to identify emission sources at an organization or facility. Then, we'll look at the difference between direct and indirect emissions. And last, we'll take a look at which emissions companies should account for. Identifying emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions typically come from one of the four following source categories: stationary combustion, mobile combustion, process emissions, or fugitive emissions. Stationary combustion is the combustion of fuels in stationary equipment such as boilers, furnaces, and incinerators. It is generally used at industrial facilities to generate electricity, heat, or steam. For example, power plants use stationary combustion to generate electricity. Cement plants use stationary combustion to generate heat. And many facilities use stationary combustion to generate steam for various reasons, such as sterilization. Mobile combustion is the combustion of fuels in automobiles, trucks, airplanes, ships, and other transportation devices. Process emissions are emissions that result from physical or chemical processes. Most of these emissions result from the manufacture of chemicals and other materials such as cement, aluminum, and ammonia. Fugitive emissions are emissions that result from the intentional and unintentional releases such as equipment leaks from joints, seals, and gaskets, HFC emissions from refrigeration and air conditioning equipment, and methane emissions from coal mines, landfills, wastewater treatment, and natural gas production. Categorizing emissions. Once the greenhouse gas emissions from an organization or facility have been identified, they must be categorized as direct or indirect. Direct emissions are emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the company. Indirect emissions are a consequence of the company's activities, but they occur at sources owned or controlled by another company. Many people get confused between organizational boundaries and operational boundaries because they both have to do with ownership and control. The difference between the two is simple. Organizational boundaries determine which business units will be included in a greenhouse gas inventory based on the company's ownership or control over those business units. Operational boundaries determine which greenhouse gas emissions will be included in the inventory based on the company's ownership or control of the emissions sources at each of those business units. Since operational boundaries are only applied to business units that fall within the organizational boundary, operational boundaries cannot be established until the organizational boundaries have been set. This diagram shows the relationship between the two types of boundaries. In this example, the parent company has 4 business operations, labeled Company A, B, C, and D. The organizational boundary established will determine which of these business units are included in the company's inventory. Then, the operational boundary will determine which emissions will be included in the inventory based on the ownership or control over the emissions sources within those business units. Scopes. The GHG protocol goes one step further in categorizing emissions. Instead of simply dividing them into direct and indirect, the GHG protocol defines 3 emissions categories called scopes. Scope 1 encompasses all direct emissions, all emissions that occur at sources owned or controlled by the company. This could include company-owned vehicle fleets, combustion equipment, or refrigeration equipment. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from generation of purchased electricity, heat, steam, or chilled water. These emissions are considered indirect because the emissions occur at the power plant where the energy is generated, not at the point where the energy is consumed. Almost every company has Scope 2 emissions because they consume electricity in one way or another. The only way a company might not have Scope 2 emissions is if they generate their own electricity, in which case the emissions would fall under Scope 1. Or if they get their power from renewable sources such as solar and wind. Scope 3 includes all other indirect emission sources, including those upstream and downstream from the company. For example, a manufacturer's upstream emissions sources could include the extraction and production of raw materials, and the transportation of those raw materials to the manufacturing facility by a third-party shipping company. Downstream emission sources could include the transportation of the finished product to the consumer, the emissions resulting from the consumer's use of the product, and the emissions resulting from the disposal of the product. A common source of Scope 3 emissions is outsourcing. For example, most companies outsource product distribution to third-party shipping companies like UPS or FedEx. Some companies even outsource the entire manufacturing process overseas. When GHG-emitting activities are outsourced, the resulting greenhouse gas emissions do not change. The only thing that changes is the ownership of the emission sources. The University of Florida Greenhouse Gas Scope Breakdown. This table shows greenhouse gas emissions at the University of Florida broken down into scopes. The university's Scope 1 emission sources include the stationary combustion of natural gas for space heating at the over 900 buildings on campus, the combustion of gasoline and diesel by the university's vehicle fleet, the combustion of aviation gas and jet fuel by the university's private aircrafts, fugitive emissions from refrigeration equipment at the university's chilled water plants, and fugitive emissions from the university's livestock production systems. The university's Scope 2 emissions include purchased electricity to power their over 900 buildings on campus, and purchase steam from an on-campus cogeneration plant. The steam is used in the winter to heat the buildings on campus. The university's Scope 3 emissions include transport-related activities such as employees and students commuting to and from the university, employee and student business travel, and the transportation of purchased materials. Also, the disposal of waste generated by the university operations, and finally, upstream and downstream emissions. Upstream emissions could result from other institutions coordinating with the university, and downstream emissions could result from employees and students doing school-related work at home. For example, when students take online courses, when they are at home, their computers are on for several hours each week. ISO versus Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It should be noted that the ISO standards for greenhouse gas accounting categorize greenhouse gas emissions in the same way as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but they use different names to describe the three categories. Scope 1 emissions are simply referred to as direct emissions. Scope 2 emissions are referred to as energy indirect emissions. And Scope 3 emissions are referred to as other indirect emissions. Reporting requirements. When it comes to reporting greenhouse gas emissions, the GHG protocol and the ISO standards both require companies to account for and report their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3, on the other hand, is an optional reporting category, so companies are not required to account for their Scope 3 emissions. In fact, the purpose of setting operational boundaries is to determine which Scope 3 emissions will be accounted for, if any. But if Scope 3 emissions are optional, then why would a company want to account for them in the first place? There are many reasons why, but put simply, accounting for Scope 3 emissions creates more opportunities to effectively manage and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Also, for many companies, Scope 3 emissions can represent a considerable portion of their total emissions. For these companies, Scope 3 emissions are also a significant opportunity for reducing emissions. In fact, some companies are beginning to realize that their Scope 3 emissions offer the lowest cost emission reductions and the greatest cost savings. In other words, for some companies, reducing indirect emissions is cheaper than reducing direct emissions. As a result, accounting for indirect emissions can help companies identify the lowest cost reductions and prioritize limited resources in a way that maximizes greenhouse gas reductions and return on investment. The Dell example. Let's take the computer company Dell as an example. Dell sells more than 50 million computers each year. But Dell doesn't manufacture these computers. The company simply orders the components from overseas, assembles the computers, and ships them to customers. As a result, Dell's Scope 1 emissions are very low, and its Scope 3 emissions are very high. In 2008, Dell was criticized when it announced that it had achieved carbon neutrality. The company achieved this by measuring its carbon footprint and buying an annual number of carbon credits to offset its emissions. Many critics thought that these carbon-neutral claims were not realistic because the company's footprint only covered a fraction of the emissions associated with its computers. The company's carbon footprint included emissions from its on-site boilers, company cars, electricity consumption, and staff business travel. These categories were in compliance with the requirements of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the ISO standards, which require companies to report Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but not Scope 3. In this case, Dell excluded all of the outsourced emissions from the suppliers who manufacture their computer parts, as well as the energy emissions from consumers using the computers, and the emissions resulting from the transportation of the computers and parts. As it turns out, these Scope 3 emissions were far greater than the Scope 1 and 2 emissions that the company reported. Thus, it's not hard to see why the company was criticized for making carbon-neutral claims. Reporting Scope 3 emissions. When companies set their operational boundaries, they must decide which Scope 3 emissions to include in their inventory. Scope 3 is a very broad category of emissions-producing activities that can encompass just about every business or product to which a company is connected. It is not necessary to account for emissions from all these activities, but companies should consider the sources most relevant to their business. When deciding which Scope 3 emissions to include in an inventory, companies should consider the following questions. Is the emissions producing activity large relative to the company's Scope 1 and 2 emissions? Is the emissions producing activity crucial to the company's core business? For instance, in Dell's case, the third-party shipping of computers to customers is a crucial aspect of the business. Does the company have any influence over reducing these emissions? Does the company outsource an activity that was previously categorized as a Scope 1 emissions? And finally, one of the more important questions, is the company able to collect the reliable data for the activity? This question is very important because the data for Scope 3 emissions is generally less accurate and reliable than data for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. In fact, the availability and reliability of the data may determine whether or not it is included in the inventory. This was Dell's major reason for excluding Scope 3 emissions from its carbon footprint.